So all of these little details that I've just shared go to show you that these are actually some pretty interesting stories with a lot of twists and turns in them. These Old Testament women, and that what I particularly wanted to notice about them in focusing on motherhood is that none of them have a traditional route to motherhood, the way that sort of patriarchal culture would think that these women's lives are supposed to go. Right, so you're supposed to be a virgin in your father's house, get married as a teenager, and then begin producing legitimate sons for your husband, right? That's sort of like patriarchy's plan for the young woman's life. But none of these women have motherhood that happens in that way.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Jennifer Houston McNeel, and we'll be discussing her book, Under Her Wings. Real quick, I just want to call out a mistake that I made during the conversation. I do a couple of times mention Andrew Peterson and songs from his album, Behold the Lamb of God, which is a Christmas album. I call one of them the wrong title. It's actually Labor of Love, not A Silent Night or whatever it is that I say in the episode. So apologies for that. The holiday season is upon us. And this is, I know from Thanksgiving to Christmas Day, I like to listen to that album. It's a really cool narrative account of the Nativity. If you're listening for free, please subscribe, follow, whatever, so that the episodes come down to you automatically as they're released. If you want to know what's coming, follow me on any of the different social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Spoutable, Blue Sky, Threads. I make sure that when I finish an interview, I post a clip out there. You can also follow on YouTube, and all the clips are available there. The highest level of support, though, would be go over to patreon.com and become a supporter for $5 a month, and you'll get episodes 10 days early. It'll actually be even earlier in 2026. So, yeah, I think that's it from me. Enjoy my conversation with Jennifer Houston McNeel. I will be back at the end of the episode to set up next week's preview. Thanks. Jennifer Houston McNeel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So Jennifer Houston McNeel. I teach at the St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute, which is part of a Roman Catholic seminary in Baltimore, Maryland, St. Mary's Seminary. But in the Ecumenical Institute, I teach students who are Catholic and Episcopalian and Baptist and Evangelical and Methodist and just about everything else you can think of. So it's a really rich learning environment with a lot of diversity in the student body. In my own work, I focus primarily on women in the New Testament. I also am interested in Paul's letters more generally and in metaphors in the Bible. Since we will be talking about my book about mothers, I will, in this case, also mention that I am a mother, a wife and a mother, and I have 2 teenage sons who are 13 and 17.
Ooh. Wow. You're on a couple of cusps there, right?
Yeah, actually, they're in 8th grade and 12th grade this year. So the end of this school year will be a pretty big deal for us.
Yeah, it will. And start taking naps now because you're going to need it. My oldest graduated last year, and it was one of those things where people are like, is it surprising that you have an adult in the house? No, it's not. I was there all along the road. I'm not surprised we got to the destination, but it is a lot. It is pretty overwhelming. And there's still moments where it occurs to me that, oh man, he doesn't need this thing. He doesn't need that thing. They just gradually fell off along the wayside. Yeah. I've said this before to people, and yours are probably past this age since they're both boys. There will be a last time that they snuggle you. And so just be aware of that every time you snuggle. Okay. I'm not trying to bum everybody out, but those are 2 exciting phases of life. So I'm excited for you. But we are, as you said, discussing your book, Under Her Wings, Mothers and Motherhood in the New Testament. So you may have already started to answer that in your introduction to who you are, but how did you come about writing this particular book?
Yeah, certainly the fact that I am a mother led to my interest in the topic. Although actually, in a way, my interest in the topic did begin before I was a mother. The story of this book really goes all the way back to when I was a master's level student and at a Lutheran seminary. And the one of the very first biblical studies papers that I ever wrote was an exegesis, an interpretation of the passage in First Thessalonians where Paul refers to himself as a nursing mother. At that time, I was not a mother myself, but I was just really fascinated by the fact that Paul in particular would refer to himself in feminine language in general and maternal language in particular. I had read Paul's letters before, but somehow I had read right past that and it just hadn't caught my attention until I was writing the paper on it. So that was the beginning of my interest in the topic. And from there, I discovered, oh, actually, that wasn't the only time that Paul refers to himself with maternal language. He actually does it in quite a few places, which is a bit surprising for a man in the ancient world. And so I actually ended up writing my dissertation when I went on for my PhD on that passage in First Thessalonians. And once I graduated from there, I thought it would be interesting to write a book, a more broad book about motherhood in the New Testament in general, not just about Paul, and not just for the academic setting either, but hopefully for a broader audience. So that's where the book began. But as once I became a mother myself, I certainly was only had my interest in the topic increased to explore it and see what was there.
So I won't. I'll do my best not to do this too much, but that made me think of some of the language that was brought to my attention by the Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Context book about Paul describing himself as a slave. That clearly he's not, but he is adopting language associated with another class of people from himself to identify something about himself. And one of them is not as accessible to us now, right? Because slavery is not part of our lexicon in any kind of concrete way, for at least for 21st century Americans. But for a man to say he's a woman, that's still not common. There are the derogatory ways, and I know now in public discourse there is the trans conversation, which is not intended as a pejorative. So this is something different than that, right? This is neither pejorative nor is it trans. He's adopting the identity, the social identity of woman, gender identity. So how sorry, there's a bunch of different thoughts because another thing that I'm thinking, I'm looking at my questions and the way that I wrote it is not what I was thinking, but just this, I know systematic theology was my first introduction to Bible study and theology, and I wonder, is there a tendency toward trying to understand a systematic or idealized version of motherhood or femininity in the Bible? And obviously you can emphasize motherhood because that's what your book is about, but is that how we should understand what Paul is saying? I know I'm all over the place, so I'm sorry about that.
I really think that what Paul's trying to do is create some kind of idealized sense of motherhood, especially because, as I talk about in one of the chapters, I don't think he was even that interested in literal motherhood in his communities, not just mostly because for two reasons, really. One, that he, like many other early Christians, he thought that the church should be more the central focus of people's lives rather than the traditional family. And I think Paul and other early Christians who took that view weren't doing it in order to be feminist, like they weren't trying to be feminist, but sometimes there were maybe some side effects of that were good for women because it gave them a little bit more freedom to pursue ministry and other things outside of the traditional patriarchal household. And Paul didn't necessarily focus that much on trying to get women to be mothers because he wanted everybody to focus on church ministry. And the other reason was that he seems to have thought that the world as we know it was coming to an end pretty soon. So he didn't have a lot of interest in the next generation, so to speak, right? Other people might think, we need to focus on motherhood because we need to make sure we have children. We need to make sure they're raised well. But that really wasn't Paul's focus. So in that sense, I don't think he was necessarily trying to create some kind of ideal motherhood among his communities. I think rather it's just that in some cases that things that motherhood involves, like giving birth, like breastfeeding, are just such rich sources of imagery that sometimes they're just the best thing to express the ideas that he was trying to express. That he wants to, if he wants to present himself as a nurturer of his communities, it's harder to find a better image for that than the wet nurse who has a chance to take care of her own children, and the tenderness of that image that he draws on in First Thessalonians, things like that. And of course, birth language is used not just by Paul, but throughout the Bible, because it's just this huge part of life, and it's this huge idea that people can use to express new life, and newness in general is just very well expressed by birth. So I think those are some of the reasons that these maternal metaphors come up.
It's interesting, kind of jumping back to the point of Paul thinking the church should really be the focal point, but I would say growing up in the 80s and 90s in churches that also believed the world could end at any moment, but that's where focus on the family originated, was in modern evangelical churches that believe those things, but they thought the family was the center of not only society but of church. So that's is that as sharp a departure as it seems? Am I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The fact that believing the world is going to end soon doesn't automatically mean you don't focus on the family. I think maybe that just has to do with some of the history of the church. So, like when I talk about Paul, what I primarily have in mind is what we call the undisputed letters of Paul, or some people call them the earlier letters of Paul. I'm in the scholarly camp that believes that Paul didn't write all 13 of the letters that are attributed to him in the New Testament, and we definitely see differences in how women are addressed and in the attitude towards family life and things of that nature in the later letters of Paul. I should say the later Pauline letters, whether Paul wrote them or not is the question. But there, I think we see in those later letters, I think we see the effects of the idea that, okay, the world didn't end quite as fast as we thought it would, right? I'm taking the perspective of early Christians here. The world didn't end quite as fast as we thought it would. We have to think about the next generation now. And not only that, we have to think about how's the church going to get along and fit into society, and how are we going to make sure that persecution doesn't overwhelm us because we're so countercultural and these kind of things. And so you see that sort of traditional Greco-Roman family values coming in towards the later part of the New Testament for those reasons. And maybe that just then gets so grounded in the church that you still see the effects of that even all these years later in terms of the type of Christianity that you were referencing. I know I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. I haven't thought this one through, but
that's fair.
Yeah.
Look, if you, it's my fault if an answer is not fleshed out, because like I said in the emails, I just kind of take your answers and, hey, that made me think of this. What about this? But so you mentioned traditional Greco-Roman family values. That's where your book begins, right? That this is what motherhood looked like. And that's been a thing that's been discussed on the podcast before, but a lot of what I've learned in the last few years is it is what you think it is, or the impression you always had, but it is different, that it's not complete and total subjugation. But I think something that I've learned, and your book does a good job of calling this out. 18 years ago, when my son was born, the issue of breastfeeding or formula was a pretty early thing, and it was a very stressful situation, less for me, but that I had this concept that, in antiquity or in prehistory, that people were just limited to what their natural capabilities were. And that's not necessarily the case.
Do you mean like with wet nursing and that?
With wet nurses, yeah, which you mentioned already, but yeah.
Yeah, I think wet nursing is an interesting thing to study in the ancient world because it gives you a window into exactly what you're talking about, how the different kinds of arrangements that could exist in families that might be different from today. And wet nursing itself is something that we're not terribly familiar with today. We would think it was weird if somebody who wasn't the mother of a baby breastfed them. Like to us, I think to many people today, that would seem like a very strange thing. But that was a very common and normal thing in the ancient world. Not that mothers never breastfed their own children, but there are just various circumstances that might lead to somebody else nursing that infant, whether it's because the mother had died, because many more women died in childbirth at that time than they do today. Um, so that could be one reason. There are circumstances in which the mother dies in childbirth, but they're able to save the infant, in which case, if you want to keep that infant alive, you obviously have to find somebody else to feed it. But even beyond that, especially among the more upper classes, there may have been various reasons that women chose to employ somebody else to nurse their infant for them.
I think it's a really good example of. Actually, I've got this in my head. I'm not going to Google it to find out when it was, but I do remember a news story sometime in the last like 20, 25 years of Selma Hayek nursing some other woman's baby. And that did come across as weird. And that's how the story was written. And I remember being like, do I need more context? What happened here? So, yeah, it is a jarring thing. Even when you know about the fact that there were wet nurses out there, it is, wait, what? What happened? Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say it was a matter of controversy in the ancient world, though. Like you were talking about the modern sort of stress over breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. In the ancient world, that same kind of sort of controversy existed, but it was like mother versus wet nurse, not breast versus bottle. So there were several elite male writers in the ancient world who wrote about social issues and made the case that mothers should breastfeed their own children. So they didn't like this idea of wet nursing, particularly because the women who did the nursing were always lower class, often enslaved women who did that kind of work. And in the ancient world, they had different understandings than we do today of even breast milk itself. That sort of like the contributions of the parents to the physically to the children's development is coming through the breast milk. So even though it's the woman doing the nursing, in fact, they thought that the father's semen was what concocted the breast milk in the woman's uterus, and then it traveled up to the breast. In a way, this controversy over wet nursing was a controversy of the husband's control over the development and rearing of his children. So if you employ a wet nurse, then that sort of takes away the power of the father to be continuing to be the one contributing to the development of that child.
Okay, look. So I've run into this several times where I think with Christy Cobb and Catherine Shaner, I called Aristotle a dumb because we're talking about his views on enslavement. And I don't know, just the weird thought processes that these ancient men. So when you said there were some social commentators in the men who had opinions on what was happening, it's so stupid. It's so silly that not only ooh, hot take, you guys, no more wet nurses, but because it removes the man from it, it feels so familiar. But okay, the part, and that's early on where I sat up and I'm like, oh, this is so exciting, is because I feel like it feels validating because I'm looking for ways that how are the things around us that we just assume are the way they are because they have to be the way that they are socially constructed. So that is not in any way to say that motherhood or fatherhood or any of that is not based in nature, but that it proceeds on from that. And so we have these ideas. So if you say that a father is a provider and that a mother is nurturing, my thought is just if I describe somebody who goes and works two jobs and then they come home and they cook, what did I just describe? That could be either person, sex is irrespective of that, even if we assign a tradition that says, oh, this role is filled by this person. And I think it being an image of love, is that what's being appealed to theologically by Paul or any other pseudo Paul or any other epistle writer or storyteller? Is that what matters about it? Is the function of motherhood?
Is love the function of motherhood? Is that what you're asking?
I think for sure it is, but I'm saying is the function of the person in the relationship the vital part? So if we're talking about mothers, yeah, I don't know, maybe that's not a well worded. I got so excited that I don't know if I asked the. So for someone like Paul, who is a man, to say, oh, I identify as a mother or wet nurse, or identification, Jesus mourning over Jerusalem, how often I have longed, that
Mhm.
kind of thing, which was my first thought when I read the title of the book. And I know I'm very scattered and I'm all over the place, but I thought of that, how often I have longed to gather you beneath my wings. That this language, like if we distilled motherhood down, it's a certain set of characteristics about love that we have to understand divine love. Is that the point of it all?
Yeah, I think you could probably say that. And so different images in the New Testament take on different aspects of that, like the nurturing versus the life giving, and protection. The one of Jesus comparing himself to a mother hen is this longing to be the protector. And thinking about Paul, I think you were asking earlier, why does a man in that situation use this language? I think another reason that we didn't touch on earlier is the difference between the way mothers and fathers were viewed in the ancient world. So the father figure is this figure of authority, right? He's invested with authority, not just in the family, but by the power of the state. The patriarchal system invests him with the authority he has in the family. And that isn't exactly the kind of authority that Paul had in his communities, right? He wasn't their king, he wasn't ruling over them. He was having to persuade them, right? And I talk a lot about the influence of mothers in the book. And I do think that mothers had a lot of influence over their children in the ancient world, but it wasn't the legally binding type of authority or influence that they had, right, of the father. It was more just through the relationship that they had with their children and the influence that is naturally a part of the mother child relationship. And so maybe that's another reason that Paul chooses to use this maternal language, even though he's a man, because that's actually closer to the relationship that he had with these early Christian communities, right? He didn't have any legal authority over them to make them behave the way he hoped they would or think the things he hoped they would think, but he was trying to persuade them, right? He was trying to influence them through the relationship he had with them. And so I think that sense of influence that a mother has, I think, is a key to many of these images in the New Testament.
I think it's interesting to see a father as the giver of life, because that's not predominant, at least from my point of view, that's not predominantly how we see it now. That it's not, oh, the father gives life and the mother just, I don't know, bears it. As far as how people come into the world, it seems like our understanding, again, in 21st century America, is more along the lines of mothers give life. And even the idea
Mm-hmm.
of mother's milk is giving life. I don't know, maybe that's why so many men feel so lonely and sad, because they, which, whatever.
Well, I
But
mean, I think we know we're chuckling when you say that, but I think in a way there's a little bit of that going on in these ancient texts where men choose to employ maternal language. It is this sort of this amazing thing that happens, right? That new human beings come out of women. And this is like one of the amazing miracles of life, right? And men do look at that from the outside and discover that it's quite a rich image to draw on, right, for theological reflection. And in some ways they seek metaphorically at times to take on that role that they see women taking.
the idea that they saw, oh, new life comes out of a woman, a man must have done that. That's
Oh,
the
well, yeah,
weird.
that too. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that point. I do think that they did try to claim responsibility for various things in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a very good job with that baby that she just had. Yeah, I'm sorry. It seems, and I understand, as procreation works, like human procreation does involve the male and female contributions to it. So they do work in confluence, but these ancient understandings of motherhood seem to be, I guess, not just subordinate to, but dependent on the understanding of fatherhood. And fatherhood is central, but motherhood is very important. And particularly listening to, you work at a Catholic institution, but like listening to Catholics, I'm like, man, there's a lot in here that my Protestant evangelical background did not give me. And yeah, no wonder, I'm sure listeners are probably tired of me saying this, but yeah, no wonder the Beatitudes didn't matter in my biblical study, education, and theological upbringing, they didn't matter that much because the cross was the point. And even to the point that like the resurrection didn't matter. But the importance of, and I don't know, maybe you read it and it was like, I don't know what this question means, but the importance, the centrality of Mary to the incarnation is really important. Do you think that the incarnation is the less important we see motherhood being to Christian theology?
Interesting question. Can you say that one more time? Just repeat it for me while I think about it.
I hope I can remember how I worded it. It is the less important the incarnation is, the less important Mary and motherhood are to Christian theology. Do you think that's true?
I don't know. I'm thinking about it because I think incarnation. Yeah, I guess if what you're saying is that traditions that focus more on the cross than anything else have maybe less emphasis on that. I think that's probably true. However, incarnation has been an important concept to lots of Christian communities, even Protestant ones, through the years, and yet the majority of those have managed to ignore Mary and the importance of motherhood and women as well, I would say. So I don't know, there may be an equal opportunity ignoring of motherhood among a whole variety of Christian traditions. And the texts of the New Testament contribute in different ways to that. We have Matthew and Luke who give us a story of Mary at the beginning, but then she disappears from the story, right? As soon as the birth stories are over, which could lead a person to question how important is she really if she doesn't say part of the story. And then the Gospel of John begins the story of Jesus and gives us a whole chapter on incarnation and manages to do that without reference to Mary at all. So I think there are aspects of the New Testament that can be fuel for people who want to sideline Mary's importance and the importance of Jesus's birth. But there's always another side to things, right? If you dig deep into the first two chapters of the Gospel of Luke, Mary plays a pretty important role, more important than anybody else in those chapters, right? Joseph doesn't feature prominently in Luke, and there are other characters there, but the spotlight is on her. And people have choices about which passages they focus on. And if you choose the first couple chapters of Luke, or you choose the first chapter of John, that's going to give you a different beginning point for how important is Mary to this story.
Specifically in the genealogy in Matthew. And I'm glad you brought this up because I don't think it was ever something I paid attention to until maybe 5 years ago. I heard on the New Testament Review podcast, they were talking about how, there's this question as to why these women in particular are named. Why not all the women, or why these women specifically? And the different proposals for why that is, it seemed like at the end of the episode it was just like, we don't know. There's a lot of different ideas out there about us. Thanks, guys. But you do discuss that in the book, that there are a number of people who have said different things to explain why that is. Would you mind walking us through that? And then, yeah, what are your thoughts? Or is it just going to be like, on the New Testament Review? I don't know.
I did make my own proposal, so I won't quite leave you with a shoulder shrug, just with the acknowledgement that different people look at it differently. So I can't promise you that I'm right, but I do have my own opinion on the matter. So there are four. So the first thing to make sure people are aware of is just that there's a whole lot of genealogies in the Old Testament, and most of them are father-son genealogies. So you don't hear who's giving birth to here, you hear who's begatting who, right? So this person begat that person, and that person begat that person. So Matthew seems to be constructing a genealogy that for the most part fits in very well with that pattern. So most of his genealogy is a father-son genealogy, but he does insert the name of four women in, as you said. So this is a test to see if I can come up with all of them off the top of my head. So we have Tamar, we have Ruth, we have Bathsheba, although he doesn't call her by her name, he calls her the wife of Uriah. And then, see, I knew I'd forget one. Who's the other one?
Are you asking me, or are you being rhetorical?
No, I'm asking myself, but it's not coming to me. Maybe I'll just talk more about them and then it will come to me. Tamar is, there are actually two Tamars in the Old Testament, so listeners have to make sure they look up the right one. But in Genesis, Tamar is married to the son of the patriarch Judah. And the husband is killed by God for being a wicked person. So the brother who's next in line marries her, but refuses to produce offspring with her. And so she goes back to live in her father's house until the next son is old enough, but Judah never follows through on marrying him. Long story short, Tamar tricks Judah into sleeping with her to produce offspring. So that's Tamar. And then we have Bathsheba. Most people probably are familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba and the adulterous encounter that happens there. But I also talk about how later on in the story, Bathsheba has more power as a queen mother in even helping to orchestrate who's going to be king next after David. And then we have Ruth. And did you figure out who the other one
Rahab.
was? Oh, thank you. How could I forget Rahab? So Rahab is a prostitute who protects the spies coming in to the land prior to the conquest. So all of these little details that I've just shared go to show you that these are actually some pretty interesting stories with a lot of twists and turns in them, these Old Testament women. And that what I particularly wanted to notice about them in focusing on motherhood is that none of them have a traditional route to motherhood, the way that sort of patriarchal culture would think that these women's lives are supposed to go, right? So you're supposed to be a virgin in your father's house, get married as a teenager, and then begin producing legitimate sons for your husband, right? That's like patriarchy's plan for the young woman's life. But none of these women have motherhood that happens in that way. Tamar dresses up as a prostitute and tricks her father-in-law into sleeping with her. Rahab actually is a prostitute. Ruth, we have the encounter with Boaz out on the threshing floor that she uncovers his body in the night and asks him to protect her and become her kinsman redeemer. And then, of course, Bathsheba being taken by David from her house and from her husband. So this is all outside of the norms and expectations of how women's lives should go. Not just women's lives in general, but the path to motherhood for all these women is unconventional in that way. So that was what was striking to me in writing a book about motherhood, was that their paths to motherhood were unconventional. And I think that really is quite relevant to the fact that Matthew is using this genealogy to set up the story of Mary, who he says in the very next verse after the genealogy is found to be with child before she is married to Joseph. So we have Mary then put in the company of these other unconventional reproductive stories from the Old Testament. And now this is a leap that I'm making, but I think that the point of that is Matthew preparing the reader to hear this unconventional marriage and birth story that he's about to tell, and understand that even in these kind of stories where things don't happen the way we think they're quote unquote supposed to, nevertheless, we can see God at work in these families and in these stories, moving the story forward to the next generation of the story of Israel, and then eventually the story of the church as well. You also asked about other views. Probably an older view is that the women were all sinners. And so Matthew wants us to understand that sinners are going to be redeemed by Jesus. Sinners can be included. But that's almost universally rejected today, and I think rightly. The women, I don't think, are really portrayed as terrible sinners in the Old Testament. I think just some more puritanical Christian readers later were scandalized and shocked by some of the things that they were doing. But I don't think the Old Testament narrative actually portrays them in that way. So that's not a helpful perspective, I think. The one that has been more popular in recent times is to understand the women as all Gentiles. And so Matthew's trying to say that Gentiles are in the ancestry of Jesus even, and will be included in this new movement that Jesus is starting. So that's a better understanding than the sinner one, but also I don't think it's really clear that all the women actually were Gentiles or would have been considered Gentiles. So I'm not a big fan of that one either.
It seems like a non sequitur too, because it doesn't connect to the actual story it's a part of. Yeah. No one who
Yeah, I
proposes that is
mean,
here to defend
right.
themselves.
I think if I were going to try to defend that view, I think I would say that there's this interesting quality to the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus says that he's not come to abolish the law and the prophets. It's the only gospel in which we have a story in which Jesus says he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not to Gentiles. And yet, it's also the only gospel that ends with the Great Commission, where Jesus says, "Go out to all nations and make disciples of them." So I do think there's a way in which, if we see the Great Commission at the end of the story and these Gentiles being included in the genealogy in chapter 1, there's a kind of a logic there to what Matthew's doing with Judaism, and with Judaism still being important and central, but Gentiles being brought in as well. So I think that would be the logic of it. But as I said, I don't actually find it entirely convincing.
I like yours better. That's all I'm
Okay.
saying. Yeah. And not just because you're here, because it makes, I don't know, internally, and it works with the narrative a little bit better. I was going to offer, there's a song called Matthew's Begats. Have you ever heard this?
No, I
It's a
don't
guy
think I
named
have.
Andrew Peterson. Yeah. I'll link it. I'll link a like a YouTube video of it or something. I just don't have the money to pay Andrew Peterson if I start singing it. But yeah, it gets all the, because like I said, I had the book right here and I couldn't remember. I think I was forgetting Rahab too. Okay. Yeah. So that is interesting that they just, okay, you have mothers, but it's not all the mothers. And oh, hold on. So actually, the thing, they're all sinners. At least two of them are definitely the victims in the narrative.
Yeah.
I'll say
But it
one
wasn't
for
always
sure.
viewed that way. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. No,
Have
Tamar. I think Tamar unequivocally, even in that time, like if you know what you're supposed to do and you refuse to do it, she is being victimized by Judah. That he
mm-hmm.
should have conducted himself otherwise. I do think if you live in a patriarchal culture, you could probably think, oh, yeah, what was David supposed to do? But he really comes across as a creep the more people like Barbara Tita. And I know every couple of years there's a fight on Twitter, which you're free of, but there's a fight on Twitter about was Bathsheba a victim or not. It seems pretty clear to me that she was. But for sure, Tamar, to a lesser extent and clarity, depending on the culture, Bathsheba, Rahab, and Ruth they're driving the narrative in the direction that the divine wants it to go. Yeah, I don't know. I like yours better. We'll move on though. I'm sorry, I'm just blanking out. I had a thought in my head and I just lost it. I'm glad you brought up the Pauline stuff, because as soon as it came up in the book, I was like, "Ooh, I wonder if it matters where these letters fall." That's more just an aside. I threw something in there about 1 Corinthians 5, and you mentioned the thing in Ruth's story about her uncovering his body. So there's this opaque language in biblical texts that doesn't make its way to us, to people like me as readers of English translations of the Bible. But in the idea of bad mothers, there's this woman in 1 Corinthians 5. How do we know that there's misconduct happening there? I know this is a trivial question. It doesn't really feed into the larger point of the book, but can you walk us through that? And if you want to explain what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure. So Paul is reprimanding the Corinthians because he says there's sexual immorality in the community, and he says of a kind that even the Gentiles don't normally engage in. So you see there a little bit of his Jewish perspective, that sort of he thought that Gentiles are the ones who do weird stuff rather than us Jews. You see a little bit of his sort of bias there in that statement. But at any rate, he thinks this is a terrible thing that's happening. And what he says it is, so if you read your English translation, obviously there's many different English translations, but many of them will say something like a man is living with his stepmother or living with his father's wife. The Greek says more literally, a man has his father's woman. That's literally what the text says. So unfortunately, that's all the detail we get, right? So you have to think about what are the possibilities for what that could mean. First of all, if it was a man that was having relations with his own mother, Paul probably wouldn't have said he has his father's woman, right? He would have said something's happening with his mother. So I think we can rule that one out, right? So it's not that type of incestuous relationship of a man having a relation with his own mother. So it's his father's woman, right? Or his father's wife. So that leaves us with a lot of questions. First of all, is the father still alive? Okay, we don't know. If the father is still alive, is he still married to this woman? We don't know that either. So it could be that this woman is a widow. It could be that this woman is still married to the man's father, and so he's having an affair with her. Or it could be that the father has divorced the woman or has passed away, and now subsequently this woman begins to have a relationship with her. One thing we have to remember is that this woman could be the age of the younger man or only a little bit older, because this is apparently his father's, at least his father's second marriage. He may have married a much younger woman the second time around. That was common in the ancient world. And so the question then is, why does this matter to Paul so much? And I think the answer is just that it was basically a sexual taboo to have relations with a woman who either was or had been married to your father. And that was, so we have laws actually against that situation in Leviticus, but there were also Roman laws, Roman incest laws that covered the situation as well. So it seems to have been taboo across cultures. Essentially, I think the Roman perspective was that when a man and a woman get married, this creates then a family relationship between the in-laws, so to speak, or the stepchildren. So she is not literally his mother, but when she married his father, from a Roman cultural perspective, she entered into a filial relationship with this younger man. And so, therefore, honestly, no matter what the status of the father is, alive or dead or divorced or not divorced, either way, this family relationship was created when she married the father. And therefore, there should not be any sexual relationship between these two people. So that's a point of agreement, I guess, between Judaism and the Greco-Roman world at that time. Nobody thought this was a good idea. And so Paul gets upset about it. Interestingly, though, he doesn't address the man directly. He seems to be actually more concerned that the community has not done anything about it. That's what's making him really mad. And to me, that's almost the more interesting question for us to ponder out of the text is not, was it wrong for a man to have relations with his stepmother in the ancient world? But how do you decide when something happening in a private home should be a concern to the whole community? So Paul, of course, thinks this thing that's occurring should be a matter of concern to the entire community. So I think that raises interesting questions for us. And I don't have an answer to that question, but it just raises the question for discussion. When is something a matter for the public to be concerned about, or the community to be concerned about? And when is something just something that's happening inside of a private home?
Yeah, and he seems to make a rather, at least from our point of view, an opaque recommendation as to what they should do with this man. Maybe it was clear at the time, but I know there's a lot of controversy around that.
You basically hand him over to Satan. What does that mean? I tend to think it just means basically push him out of the community and hopefully he'll repent and then come back in. But that's just an interpretation. We don't know for
No,
sure.
yeah, but some people thought that meant kill him.
Yeah. It could be, but I don't think so, but it could be. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not advocating that. I
Yeah.
just, that was surprising. I know in a past interview, we discussed an article about that. It's like, kill him. How does that? I don't know how you make sense of that. But yeah, so we're coming up close on time. Thank you for indulging where my brain takes everything. Was there anything from the book, and there was plenty that got left out. Was there anything from the book that you were hoping I would ask about that has not come up so far?
Oh, I'll say a few things. One would just be that just to make sure listeners are aware that I do talk about the actual mothers of the New Testament. We talked a lot today about the metaphors and the men calling themselves women and that kind of thing, which is fine. That's a big part of the book. But if listeners are interested in hearing about the mothers that are in the healing stories in the Gospels, or more about Mary, or any of those kinds of things, that's in there too. I think one thing that was something that I really discovered as I did the work of writing the book was how much danger and suffering were associated with motherhood over and over again by the Bible in general and the New Testament in particular, which is, I think, maybe something that wouldn't be obvious to everybody. that, I don't know, is suffering the first thing that comes to people's minds today when you mention motherhood? I don't know. Maybe in some cases it is, but not for everyone, I think. And just the danger of giving birth in the ancient world was a real danger for women. And then even if you successfully gave birth, perhaps as many as about 50% of the infants born alive in the ancient world would die during childhood. So danger, pain, struggle, and death were really ever present realities for ancient people surrounding mothers and motherhood. And we see that, I think, reflected in the pages of the New Testament. Mary is told by Simeon in the Gospel of Luke that a sword will pierce her soul, related to her motherhood of Jesus. The Matthew gives us the image of Rachel weeping for her children with the slaughter of the innocents. It goes on and on. It's like has those associations throughout the New Testament. So that was something that I really noticed about motherhood in the Bible that I thought I would mention.
Yeah, and I think that still, I know that still exists in some of the conversation around motherhood culturally, particularly in the context of reproductive freedom. The concern of the rate of women bleeding out during childbirth still in the United States is, I know, much higher than a lot of people think that it is, and complications due to pregnancy, like the these are very common things even still. And so to live in a world that did not have the kind of medical interventions that we have now, just commonly, yeah, that is yeah, I appreciate you making that point. That's a very good point about the perception within the, I don't know, there's a romanticized understanding of the Virgin Mary giving birth. And that's another thing on the same, it's the Matthews Begats comes from a Christmas album. And there's also a song called, wait, why am I, Not a Silent Night, about that. And yeah, there is kind of a painful messiness in that song, and that's part of what makes it so beautiful. And all the mothers I know who've heard that album really appreciate that song.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm glad that's a thing that you highlighted. Where would you direct listeners to read, watch, listen to things that they can learn more about motherhood in the ancient world, motherhood throughout the Bible? Obviously, in addition to reading this book, buy this book.
Right.
It's a good book.
So there's another book about motherhood in the New Testament, which is in the same lane as mine, but actually takes a very different approach than I did. So if readers are interested in reading something quite different than what I did, that is called Blessed Among Women. And I say it that way because there's a question mark at the end of the title, Blessed Among Women, Mothers and Motherhood in the New Testament. That's by Alicia Myers. She goes a lot more than I did into sort of ancient medical and biological and social understandings of women's bodies and motherhood in the ancient world. So I talked just a little bit about how did people understand breastfeeding in the ancient world and this kind of thing. But I touch on those things a little bit in this book, but that's her main focus. So if anybody's interested in seeing a different perspective that comes out of that, you could pick up that book. There aren't a lot of other books that are specifically about motherhood in the New Testament, which is part of the reason I decided to write one. There's a lot of great books, though, about women in the New Testament, women in the Bible. And of course, many of those touch on mothers because many of the women of the Bible are mothers. So I could give a few recommendations on that score. I do, especially for people who don't have theological degrees themselves. The book Women in the Bible by Jamie Clark Souls in the Interpretation series is a great one for people to read just to get more of a sense of what's the place and role of women in the Bible as a whole. That one is, I would say, leans more towards literary study of the women of the Bible. For a more historical approach, I really Women Remembered by Helen Bond and Joan Taylor. They take a historical approach to women as disciples of Jesus in the New Testament. And then one more, especially because we were talking earlier about the influence of mothers, which is what makes this one come to mind. There's a book by James McGrath, What Jesus Learned from Women. I think I have that title right. What Jesus Learned from Women. It's a little bit of a provocative title for some people. The idea that Jesus learned things from anyone, but especially women in particular, might be provocative in some circles. But that's a really interesting book looking at that topic.
I'm sure if the people who don't like that met James McGrath, they would have a hard time being angry with him because he's such a nice guy. If I may, there's two that come to mind. I mentioned her before we started recording. Amy Peeler's Women in the Gender of God. I know I enjoyed that. And Susan Hyland's Finding Phoebe was
Mm-hmm.
helpful for me, just getting an understanding of the world around the New Testament. And yeah, so she does a good job, I think, of walking you through the things that are just briefly mentioned in Romans when Phoebe is brought up to solve the mystery of who this woman was.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to sign on to those recommendations.
Okay, good. You didn't have to. Yeah, but I knew I'm taking a risk when I throw my recommendations in there at this part. What do you read for fun?
I do read a variety of different kinds of novels. I like sometimes historical novels, sometimes ones that are contemporary but come from a different culture from my own. That's if I have enough brain power left that I want to actually read for fun but also learn something. I like to use novels to read about the lives of people who live in cultures different from mine. When I don't have enough brain power to think that I want to learn something, I do read murder mysteries and things like that. I especially am enjoying the Three Pines series by Louise Penny, set in Canada. So I do that. That's my turn my brain off reading. That's about it. I guess
Cool.
technically right now, what I'm reading right now is actually The Lord of the Rings, which is different from all those other things I just said.
Why technically? What?
I just meant that it was different. I sort
Okay.
of just gave you one impression of what I like to read, and then but what I'm reading right now is actually quite different from
Okay.
those other things.
Is this your first
But
time?
it's my second. I read it a long time ago, and then most of the rest of the world I saw the Peter Jackson movies, and I think that those replaced the books in my brain. And it occurred to me recently that I wanted to go back and remember what the original was actually like, so I decided to read it again.
I feel like I'm glad you said that. I don't feel like enough people like call out that there is a distinction between what in the movies and what you come across in the books. Like one, there's no Tom Bombadil, which I understand the movies still work without that, but then also Rivendell is so overbearing to me anyway in the movies. And I
Mm-hmm.
know this is heterodox to a lot of people that I'm saying something negative about those movies, but it's the last homely house. Like it's supposed to be welcoming and inviting, and
Mm.
it's I don't know. And you don't have to agree with that. That's just me lobbing my hot take out there that it's so severe. The movies are much more severe in places where they
Yeah.
should be welcoming and inviting.
I do agree
And
that that phrase, the last homely house, doesn't really, it wouldn't be at home in the movie. They wouldn't dare call it that in the movie. Yeah.
I also I love The Hobbit. That's my that and Watership Down are just like security blankets to me. And I'd forgotten until recently how just nasty the elves are in The Hobbit. It
Mm.
I think I had this vision of them as just I don't know a little more angelic or beatific or something, and that's from the Peter Jackson like the Lord of the Rings world. But they're just kind of mean spirited in The Hobbit, and I didn't remember that. Anyway, yeah, no, I won't. Cool. So Lord of the Rings. Anything else? What? Okay, so when your brain doesn't want to read or do anything, what do you do to decompress?
I probably mostly watch Netflix. Yeah.
What particularly like mysteries over there?
Yeah, probably sometimes. I'm trying to think what I've been into lately. I don't know, this is slightly less turning the brain off and actually more relevant to the conversation we've been having, but I do really call The Midwife. I It's a BBC series, but I catch it later on Netflix. So about midwives earlier in the 20th century. So that I do really enjoy that series.
I know of it. I have not watched it yet, but I
Mm.
will say if you like mysteries, The Residence, have you watched that?
Oh yes, I did. I like that very much.
It's so
Yeah,
good.
it was.
And we're excited. I know this isn't on Netflix, but we're excited here that Only Murders in the Building is coming back soon.
I haven't seen that one. I'll
Oh,
have
and
to
Bake Off, as we sit down, like Bake Off is back. So I don't know if you're a Bake Off fan, but if you like British stuff,
give it a
and
try.
you don't watch the Great British Baking
No,
Show,
sorry.
it's here's the thing. Even if you don't care about baking, people are just being kind to each other. like
I do
in the
like that.
context, yeah, in the
Yeah.
context of a competition, they're just being friendly and lovely, and it just seems like it comes across to me as genuine. It's a really nice experience, and I'm actually getting misty eyed talking about it. I love that show a lot. Anyway, I won't take up any more of your time. I really appreciate you sitting down with me. Take
Yeah.
care.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Here we are at the end of the episode once again. I don't have a lot to go over right now. So, yeah, next week on the podcast will be Evan Vossman, and we'll be discussing a tour of the Torah that he put together for his church. You can get access to this episode now if you're listening for free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Other than that, thank you so much for your support. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
You do well to mention scribes. I don't think any regular person has any capacity to write text like this. At the very most, the average person might be able to spell their name. They might know enough to read a business receipt for a transaction of some kind. But even that is not super common, I don't think, in the ancient world. So when we get to the really complex narratives and poetry and legal texts that we see in the Pentateuch, this is the work of scribes. Like, this is the work of a very small elite group of people.
So just an average, a person who gets up and they, a subsistence farmer, say, they wouldn't have much engagement with these texts at all in their developmental phase, would they?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, Yonasan Adler argues in his recent book, The Origins of Judaism, that the laws and traditions that we see within the Torah or the Pentateuch don't become widespread until the Hasmonean period. I think his argument is pretty compelling in the book.
Do we know much about like any kind of social upheaval as some of these new things start to congeal, some of these new ideas start to present themselves, whether it's through text or in daily life?
Like as the texts become more widely known?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you see groups being defined by how they relate to the ideas of purity. So that would be one example. As notions of ritual purity become more widely known, you see different groups emerge that have a distinct stance on purity. So Yair Furstenberg does great work on this. Yeah, how can groups define themselves by how they conceptualize this?